What if the most powerful philosopher-king in history had to face your problems? This is how Marcus Aurelius would navigate every decade since 1900. 1900s, dawn of a new era. The dawn of the 20th century would fascinate Marcus Aurelius. Steel giants rise from concrete foundations as humanity enters an age of unprecedented innovation. Horse-drawn carriages share muddy streets with early automobiles, while the Wright brothers prepare to conquer the skies. Edison's electric lights transform night into day, and Tesla's dreams of wireless power spark a new technological revolution. Marcus would see striking parallels to Rome's own industrial ingenuity. Yet, standing in these transforming cities, he would notice something deeper: the unchanging nature of human ambition. The same drive that built the Roman aqueducts now pushes humans to harness electricity and split atoms. In the bustling factories, he would recognize the same social struggles that plagued his empire. Workers toil in dangerous conditions, while industrial barons amass fortunes that would make Roman senators blush. Children labor in dim workshops, their small hands feeding the machines of progress. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. These humans chase progress like we chased glory. They build higher, move faster, reach further, but they forget that all progress without wisdom leads to destruction. True innovation isn't in their machines, but in their capacity to use these tools for the greater good. 1910s. The Great War. In this decade, Marcus would witness humanity's technological progress turn against itself. The world he once knew of close combat and visible enemies transforms into mechanized slaughter. Trenches snake across Europe like open wounds, while machines of war turn fertile fields into graveyards. Gas masks become more common than bread, and soldiers fight enemies they never see. The philosopher-king, who led campaigns against the Germanic tribes, would find no glory in this industrialized carnage. The same human ingenuity that lit up cities now illuminates night raids. The chemistry that created medicines now fills shells with poison gas. Young men march to war with the same songs and dreams as his Roman legions, but return as shadows, if they return at all. In the midst of this chaos, Marcus would observe a peculiar irony. Humanity's advancement had made war more efficient, but not more purposeful. The scale of destruction would humble even an emperor who had seen Rome's bloodiest conflicts. Yet in the chaos, he'd recognize familiar patterns, the same pride, fear, and tribal thinking that sparked conflicts in his time. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They call this a war to end all wars, but they forget that war lives not in weapons but in hearts. Peace comes not from victory, but from understanding our common humanity. 1920s, the roaring decade. Like watching Rome's grandest festivals spiral into decadence, Marcus would observe the 1920s with a mixture of fascination and concern. The post-war euphoria erupts into an unprecedented celebration of life, wealth, and excess. Jazz rhythms replace war drums, and hemlines rise with stock prices. Prohibition creates an underground empire of speakeasies, while Wall Street spawns paper millionaires overnight. In Chicago's smoky clubs and New York's glittering parties, he'd see echoes of Roman feasts where senators drank from golden cups, while philosophers warned of coming doom. The decade roars with newfound freedoms: women voting, races mixing in Harlem's clubs, and social boundaries crumbling like ancient walls. Yet beneath the champagne bubbles and Charleston dancers, Marcus would detect the same human frailties he warned against: the belief that prosperity equals virtue, that wealth equals wisdom, that good times will never end. In the glittering eyes of flappers and the confident smirks of stockbrokers, he'd recognize the dangerous intoxication of excess. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They dance as if mortality cannot touch them, spend as if fortune cannot turn, and live as if consequences do not exist, but nature's laws cannot be repealed by human celebration. 1930s, the Great Depression. Where champagne once flowed, soup lines now stretch. Marcus would witness humanity's greatest economic collapse with the steady gaze of a Stoic who understood fortune's fickle nature. The mighty towers of capitalism, seemingly unshakable, crumble like ancient temples. Bankers who once played gods now sell apples on street corners, while dust storms devour America's heartland, turning fertile fields into modern deserts. In Hoovervilles across America, he'd see the same scenes that played out in Rome during times of famine, the wealthy hoarding resources, the poor sharing what little they have, humanity's character revealed in crisis. Yet amidst the desperation, Marcus would observe something remarkable. Communities binding together, families sharing last morsels, neighbors helping neighbors. The philosopher who wrote about adversity as life's greatest teacher would find vindication in this decade. In breadlines, he'd see senators and servants standing as equals. In community kitchens, he'd witness the wealthy learning humility and the poor teaching generosity. The Depression strips away society's artificial distinctions, leaving only raw humanity. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. In prosperity they forgot they were brothers. In hardship they remember. Suffering like a sculptor's chisel reveals the true form within. 1940s, world at war. The decade opens with humanity plunging into its darkest chapter. Marcus, who faced barbarian invasions, would stand horrified at warfare's evolution. Cities vanish in atomic flashes, camps industrialize genocide, and civilization itself hangs by a thread. The scale of destruction would dwarf anything in his meditations. Yet in this darkness, he'd witness humanity's greatest acts of courage. French resistance members dying rather than surrendering their principles. British civilians enduring the Blitz with stoic resolve. Japanese Americans serving a country that imprisoned their families. Russian soldiers sacrificing millions to stop fascism's advance. Jewish partisans fighting back against extinction. The emperor who wrote about duty would recognize it in Rosie the Riveter, in code breakers working endless hours, in soldiers storming beaches knowing they wouldn't return. He'd see how ordinary humans, when tested, could rise to extraordinary heights of virtue or sink to unimaginable depths of vice. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They have created weapons that would terrify Mars himself, yet the greatest battles remain internal, between courage and fear, between hatred and humanity, between vengeance and mercy. 1950s, atomic anxiety. A decade of contradictions unfolds before Marcus's eyes. Suburban prosperity blooms, while nuclear fear casts long shadows. Children practice duck and cover drills while their parents build backyard bomb shelters. Television brings the world into living rooms, while McCarthyism makes neighbors suspicious of neighbors. Marcus, who valued truth above comfort, would see how prosperity masks deeper anxieties. Behind white picket fences and tail-finned cars, he'd recognize the same existential dread that plagued Rome, the fear that everything built could vanish in an instant. The Cold War's invisible battles would remind him of political intrigues in his own court. Yet he'd also witness remarkable resilience. The civil rights movement gains momentum, challenging injustice with dignity. Science and exploration accelerate as humans reach for the stars. Rock and roll breaks down racial barriers that laws cannot touch. The same species that split the atom also discovers DNA's double helix. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They live between unprecedented comfort and unprecedented terror. Some seek shelter in conformity, others in rebellion. But wisdom lies in accepting both the day's joy and its uncertainty. 1960s, Revolution of Consciousness. Marcus would witness a decade where the old order crumbles like ancient marble. Young people reject their parents' certainties with the same fervor his own era's Stoics rejected materialism. The Beatles replace Mozart, communes challenge suburbs, and television brings war's reality into peaceful homes. Civil rights marchers face fire hoses with the dignity of philosophers facing tyranny. Vietnam divides the nation like no conflict since Rome's civil wars. Marcus, who wrote of justice, would watch Muhammad Ali choose principle over glory, King preach non-violence in the face of violence, and astronauts touch the moon while riots burn below. Women burn restrictions like temple offerings, while environmental awareness rises from industrial ashes. The emperor who valued truth would see psychedelics open doors of perception, while the counterculture questions every assumption. The generation gap widens like a social earthquake, swallowing traditions whole. Yet beneath the chaos, he'd recognize an eternal pattern. The young seeking meaning, the old clutching certainty, and truth hiding somewhere between. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They tear down temples believing they destroy gods, only to build new temples to new gods. True revolution begins not in streets, but in souls. 1970s, age of disillusion. The optimism of the 60s crashes like a fallen empire. Marcus would observe Watergate poisoning trust in leadership, while oil crises reveal prosperity's fragility. The same youth who preached peace now chase cocaine and disco's artificial paradise. Vietnam's end brings not triumph, but exhaustion, while inflation devours savings like locusts in a Roman grain field. Yet innovation flourishes in unlikely places. Personal computers emerge from garages, hip-hop rises from urban decay, and environmental consciousness grows like stubborn weeds through concrete. Marcus would recognize how chaos breeds creation, just as Rome's troubles produced its greatest art and philosophy. The philosopher who taught acceptance would watch Americans grapple with new realities, shifting global power, environmental limits, social changes' true cost. Star Wars and Jaws create modern myths, while punk rock strips away pretense like a Stoic's logic. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They mourn lost innocence, not realizing innocence was always an illusion. Wisdom begins when illusions end. 1980s, material world. Reagan's America would remind Marcus of Rome's more prosperous periods, wealth flowing like wine, while poverty deepens like shadows at sunset. Wall Street's Gordon Geckos replace forum merchants, their greed just as naked. MTV creates desires as powerful as any temple cult, while AIDS forces society to confront mortality's unchanging reality. The Cold War's end would interest the philosopher who knew victory's complexities. Walls fall, not to armies, but to humanity's persistent desire for connection. Technology accelerates like a chariot without reins. Personal computers, video games, and cable TV reshape consciousness as thoroughly as Roman roads once reshaped commerce. Marcus would see materialism reaching religious intensity. Designer labels become status symbols, while crack cocaine ravages inner cities. The same decade that launches space shuttles also spawns homelessness on an unprecedented scale. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They worship wealth more openly than we ever worshipped Jupiter, not seeing how their golden chains bind them. True freedom comes not from possession, but from wisdom. 1990s, digital dawn. Marcus would observe humanity stepping into a virtual realm as profound as any philosophical conception of parallel worlds. The internet spreads like an invisible empire, connecting minds across distances that would humble Roman road builders. In Silicon Valley garages, young visionaries forged digital tools with the same fervor Roman craftsmen once shaped iron and bronze. The end of the Cold War brings not peace, but new complexities. The philosopher who understood power's responsibility would watch America become an unopposed superpower, facing the same challenges Rome faced after Carthage fell. Globalization weaves economies together like a vast tapestry, while local cultures struggle to maintain their threads. Generation X's irony and cynicism would remind Marcus of his own era's cynics. Music shifts from hair metal's excess to grunge's raw truth-telling. The LA riots and Oklahoma City bombing reveal society's fragile foundations, while the Clinton era's prosperity masks deeper uncertainties. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They build a new world in light and electricity, believing virtual connections equal real ones, but wisdom cannot be downloaded, and truth cannot be accessed by clicking. 2000s, terror and technology. The new millennium opens with towers falling, an echo of Rome's greatest fears. Marcus, who faced barbarian invasions, would see terrorism's asymmetrical warfare rewrite military doctrine. The same technology promising connection becomes a tool for surveillance and division. Social media platforms rise like new forums, while smartphones become modern scrolls. The philosopher would recognize how these tools, like Roman roads, serve both connection and conquest. The 2008 financial crisis reveals the same human hubris he warned against, the belief that clever financial instruments could overcome economic nature's laws. Reality TV creates new forms of gladiatorial combat, while YouTube democratizes expression like nothing since the printing press. Privacy erodes as digital life expands, and truth becomes increasingly malleable in the Internet's endless hall of mirrors. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They carry libraries in their pockets, yet grow more ignorant, connect instantly, yet feel more isolated. The medium changes, but the message remains. Wisdom requires discernment. 2010s, social awakening. A decade of movements and counter-movements unfolds like a complex philosophical debate. Black Lives Matter confronts racial injustice with an urgency Marcus would recognize from slave revolts. Social media transforms from connection tool to political battlefield, while artificial intelligence raises questions about consciousness that would fascinate Stoic philosophers. Climate change forces humanity to face its impact on nature, while political polarization splits society like competing Roman factions. The Me Too movement challenges power structures as old as Rome itself. Truth becomes a casualty in the information wars, with fake news spreading faster than ancient rumors in the forum. Cryptocurrency promises financial revolution while revealing eternal human dreams of unearned wealth. The smartphone era reaches maturity, reshaping human behavior more profoundly than any technology since written language. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They fight not with swords, but with tweets, yet the wounds cut just as deep. Each seeks truth in their own echo chamber, forgetting that truth lives in the spaces between. 2020s, global reckoning. The pandemic would remind Marcus, who ruled during Rome's Antonine Plague, how disease reveals society's true character. Lockdowns force humanity to confront isolation, while digital technology becomes both lifeline and prison. The philosopher who wrote about accepting nature's laws would see humans struggling against biological reality. Political divisions reach Roman civil war levels of intensity, while climate disasters accelerate like omens. Artificial intelligence advances raise philosophical questions about consciousness and free will that would engage the deepest Stoic thinkers. Work and education transform as virtual spaces compete with physical ones for humanity's attention. The rise of authoritarianism and the challenge to democratic norms would remind Marcus how fragile political systems remain. Yet he'd also see unprecedented potential for human advancement, space exploration, medical breakthroughs, and technological innovations that approach the magical. Marcus would likely write this in his journal. They stand at a crossroads familiar to every age, between wisdom and folly, between unity and division, between growth and destruction. The choice, as always, lies not in their tools but in their hearts.